He was the most powerful man alive, and he destroyed everything he had because of one feeling he never once admitted to himself. Spoilers ahead. He didn't want to rule the world. He wanted to stop dying. That's the line most readings of this story miss. The Fall of Númenor gets filed under hubris, a proud king who reached too far and paid the price. Clean lesson, easy moral. But when you track Ar-Pharazôn's actual decisions, what you find underneath the conquest and the fleets and the war against the gods is something much more specific and much more human. A man who was terrified, not of enemies, not of failure, of the end of himself, and a civilization that handed that fear a throne. To understand what actually happened to Numenor, you have to start not with Sauron, not with the fleet, but with a question that nobody in the story asks out loud. What does a man do when the thing he's most afraid of is the one thing no amount of power can stop? Numenor was by any measure the greatest human civilization that had ever existed. The Dunedain were gifted with lives far longer than ordinary men, centuries, not decades. They built fleets that no enemy could challenge. They established dominion over lands they'd never even seen. At the height of Ar-Pharazôn's reign, Sauron, the most dangerous force in the world at that time, surrendered to him without a battle because the alternative was worse. This was not a man who lacked for power. This was not a man who had been humiliated or cornered or left with nothing to lose.
And yet, the first thing Sauron whispers to him is about death.
That detail is not incidental. Sauron is precise. He doesn't approach Ar-Pharazôn with an offer of more power. The man already has more power than anyone alive. He approaches him with an explanation. He tells him that the Valar, the divine powers who shaped the world, are withholding immortality from mankind, that men were meant to have it, that this limitation isn't natural, it's political. It's a decision someone made, and someone can unmake.
This works because it doesn't introduce a new desire into Ar-Pharazôn's psychology. It finds the one that was already there and gives it a direction. Here is what the established record of his behavior tells us about what Ar-Pharazôn actually wants. Not power in the abstract, he has that. Not recognition, he has that too. What he wants, what every major decision in his reign points toward, is continuity of self. He is not building an empire for the joy of building. He is building proof that he cannot be ended. Each conquest is a statement, a refusal, delivered loudly in the language of armies, against the fact that he will eventually stop existing. His marriage to Muriel, his cousin and the rightful heir, wasn't passion. It was a structural move, a consolidation of a claim that felt, at some level he may not have consciously understood, like it was slipping. The longer he lives, the more visible death becomes. That's the particular cruelty of the Númenorian condition that nobody talks about. They were given extended lifespans, specifically so they could grow in wisdom before the end. The intention was depth. What Ar-Pharazôn experienced instead was a longer runway with the same wall at the end of it. More time didn't reduce his fear. It gave his fear more room, more centuries to watch himself get closer to the thing he couldn't accept. By the time Sauron arrives as his prisoner, Ar-Pharazôn isn't a man who needs to be tempted. He's a man who needs to be translated. His fear already exists in full. What he lacks is a framework that makes the fear feel like something other than weakness. Sauron provides that framework. He tells Ar-Pharazôn that fear is the correct response, because the thing he fears is real. It was arranged against him deliberately, and a man with his resources could, in theory, do something about it. A man who is simply afraid will often resist comfort, because comfort asks him to accept the thing he fears. But a man who is convinced he's been robbed will go to war. That's the mechanism. That's what Sauron does. He doesn't corrupt Ar-Pharazôn's psychology. He reroutes it. He takes an existing wound and gives it a target. Within 3 years of arriving in Numenor as a captive, Sauron is Ar-Pharazôn's chief counselor.
The man who conquered him without a battle is now taking his advice on matters of state and religion. This gets read as weakness, as susceptibility, as proof of pride blinding him to manipulation. But look at it more carefully. No one else in Ar-Pharazôn's court was willing to name his fear directly. The faithful, those Numenorians still loyal to the old ways, to the Valar, to the elves, told him to accept limits, to find meaning within mortality. That's not what a man like Ar-Pharazôn can hear. Sauron said something else. Sauron said, "Your instinct is right, your enemy is real, and I know where it lives."
That's not corruption. That's exploitation of a pre-existing wound by someone who understood exactly where to press.
Now here is where the story makes a choice, and it's a choice worth examining carefully.
The narrative frames the assault on Valinor as madness, as an act so beyond reason that the world itself has to break in response. And in a literal sense, it is. Ar-Pharazôn leads his fleet across the sea toward the realm of the gods, and the world is physically unmade as a result. The undying lands are removed from the physical world. Numenor is swallowed by the ocean. The entire shape of the world changes.
The story calls this the consequence of pride, and it needs to call it that, because the alternative is more uncomfortable. If you track the psychology consistently, if you follow the through line of a man who has spent his entire reign trying to escape the one thing he cannot escape, then the fleet is not madness. It is the most rational decision he could make, given the premises he's operating from. His premises are wrong, but his logic is intact. He was told that immortality was being withheld from him deliberately. He was told that existed, somewhere, physically, in a direction he could sail. He had the most powerful fleet in the history of the world. What else would a man like this do?
The story chooses the clean moral because the clean moral is useful. Hubris is a lesson. What Ar-Pharazôn actually experienced is harder to moralize about because it's harder to dismiss. The terror of death is not a character flaw. It's a condition. The flaw is in what he did with it, and in the absence of anyone around him who could redirect it.
That absence is worth sitting with, because it's where the alternate path begins.
The fleet gets built because no one names the fear. Not as weakness, not as accusation, but plainly as a fact, in a way that Ar-Pharazôn might actually be able to hear. Miriel, who understands him better than anyone, and who knows what he's moving toward, spends her energy opposing him politically rather than reaching him personally. The faithful offer wisdom framed as correction. Nobody offers him a way through. Sauron fills that space because the space is open. In an alternate movement of this story, one that stays entirely within the logic of who these people are, Ar-Pharazôn, at the moment of Sauron's arrival, treats him as what he actually is, a defeated enemy, too dangerous to elevate, useful only as a signal of Numenorian dominance. He is exiled, not imported. He never gets the proximity. He never gets the translation.
But the fear doesn't go away. What changes is the direction it moves.
Without Sauron's reframing, Ar-Pharazôn's fear has nowhere to go but inward. A man this intelligent, stripped of the external target, would eventually have to ask himself what the fear is actually about. And the one civilization in the world that has dealt longest with the question of mortality and meaning, that has worked through exactly this grief and come out the other side, is the one he's been cutting himself off from, the elves.
A psychologically consistent Ar-Pharazôn, facing his fear without a war to aim it at, doesn't become peaceful. He becomes a different kind of driven. He reaches toward the elves, not out of virtue, but out of desperation. He wants what they have. He wants to understand it. He pursues that understanding the way he pursued everything, relentlessly, with resources, with force of will.
This doesn't make him good. It makes him a different kind of dangerous, one whose reach goes toward knowledge and alliance rather than conquest and annihilation. Numenor survives, perhaps diminished, perhaps fractured by the tension between those who follow the king toward the elves and those who want nothing to do with either. But the island doesn't sink. The fleet doesn't sail west. the world doesn't break.
And Sauron, without a civilization to work through, without a king whose psychology he can translate, waits, is delayed, perhaps significantly.
The ripple from one fear, named at the right moment, extends further than any fleet.
There's a version of the Fall of Númenor that ends differently, not because Ar-Pharazôn becomes someone he isn't, but because the people around him do one thing his actual story never gave them. They see him clearly, and they say so. That's the version the story doesn't tell. Maybe because it's harder to depict. Maybe because it doesn't have an ocean collapsing into the void for its finale. Or maybe because a man saved from his own fear by someone willing to name it out loud is a quieter kind of ending. And quieter endings are harder to remember.
He had everything a man could want, but the thing he couldn't have was the only thing that mattered to him. That's not pride. That's a much older kind of pain.
He had everything a man could want, but the thing he couldn't have was the only thing that mattered to him. That's not pride. That's a much older kind of pain, and it shows up in stories like this more often than most people notice. If that kind of analysis is what you're looking for, this channel does exactly that. No recaps, no theories, just the logic underneath the story. Subscribe if that's worth your time.